Okay, maybe start. I don't know what the title is, I'm just doing an introduction. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Our Lady, seat of wisdom,
Pray for us.
in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Well, I'm still on introducing the subject because we have so many things to do. Come in, Pat. Come on, sit.
No.
Yes, I did. Thank you. All right. Last week we were talking about God creating man, giving us grace, and so on. I would like to say a bit more about that. We were talking about man made up of body and spiritual soul. So, and I explained the difference between soul and spirit. And the soul is the principle of life in the living body. Any living body has a soul. And the spirit is what can be and do without matter. So in other words, there are some souls that are spiritual, like the human soul, and therefore immortal. And there are some souls, like vegetative souls and sensitive souls, that are material and mortal. Come in, plenty of room there. It's all right. We saw that. Now, when we act, we don't act immediately through our souls. We act through powers. And powers are, another name for power is faculties. And they are, I'll put this, can do. Something that enables us to do something. Like, for example, your eyes or your power of sight. Margaret, this chair's there.
I'll go down there, yes, thanks.
You're welcome.
I'll see him somewhere.
Andrew, you'll get another chair there. Who else was there? Michael. Right. So you see, every soul results in some powers. We don't act through our souls. Our souls are not they are the root of all our actions, but we act through powers. And so every soul results in some powers. The vegetative soul results in vegetative powers, nutrition, growth, and generation. The sensitive soul results in sensitive powers. We saw that last week, didn't we? Knowledge, there's one there, eh? Knowledge and appetitive powers. And then the human soul has intellect and will over and above all these other powers. I did put that on the board last week, didn't I? Okay. So now we are going to have a look at the difference between the powers that are non-spiritual, or, to put them another way, organic. You see, the powers have organs when some powers have. So we put the powers. We have organic powers. That means they have an organ. And inorganic powers don't reside in an organ. So we have our eyes, for example, are organic. We have an organ of sight. We have organs of sight. And so these powers are organic. You'll see that vegetative and sensitive powers are organic. And intellectual powers are inorganic. Intellectual, that means the intellect, and the intellectual will, which is appetite, intellectual appetite, which is will. So we have these, what I'm trying to say is that for these powers to work, we need the organ and we need a soul. There's one chair here, Alex. One chair there and two at the back. Okay.
I hope we can do it without anybody noticing us.
Oh, you might have noticed, don't you?
Michael, Alice, that's Michael.
Another Michael.
Thanks. I don't want to be a trouble to anyone.
It's another one. We'll soon settle down.
Let's just get down and keep quiet.
Okay, right. Now, these organic powers, in order to work, need to have the organ provided by the body and the soul together, working together. So if you have a dead horse, he can't see, can he? Even if he has very good eyes. Why? Because there's no soul. If you have a live horse but he has no eyes, he can't see either. Why? Because no organ. So these powers require all the organs and the souls. Organ plus soul in order to work. They need both. This provides the matter and this provides the form. So that you need to have the organ and the soul. Now when we come to the intellect, and the intellectual powers are only two, intellect and will. This is the power for understanding and the will is the power for appetizing, wanting or running away or reacting to the knowledge. I can't spell on the board, no, I never learned. Appetizing. Now the will is not a knower, it's a goer. It only goes for things or runs away from things or whatever. It reacts to the knowledge. The knowledge, which is that kind of knowledge, is in the intellect. And when we talk about knowledge, we are talking knowledge is either sensitive, which we know through the senses, or it is intellectual and it is understanding of it. And that's intellectual. Now, all these powers have an organ. You have an organ of sight, and an organ to digest your food, an organ for reproduction. We have all these powers are organic. Now, when we come to the spiritual powers, which belong only to the spiritual soul or spirits, all spirits have an intellect and will. They are inorganic. You have no organ of intellect in your body. That they belong to the soul only. And that's why after we die, we still retain our mind and we still retain our will. We still love those people we loved before we died, and we still know them and whatever, because, and actually we know all the things we knew while we were in this life. We lose our powers of sight and hearing and smell and that because we lose the body, don't we, after death? We haven't got the body. I mean, before the general resurrection. But we keep all that we had in the will and in the intellect. So they are spiritual powers. Now, always infallibly, when I say that, somebody will say, what about the brain? Yeah, well, the brain is what is a condition. It's something the intellect depends on in order to understand. But it can understand without the brain. The brain is the seat. You see, to explain this, we have, when we talk about the senses, I don't know what happened to mine. When we talk about the senses, you see, we divide the senses, philosophically speaking, I'm not speaking scientifically now, senses, they are powers for knowledge, and we have to see in a minute what is the difference between sense knowledge and intellectual knowledge. Now, the senses, but the
Difference between
the internal and the external, yes, internal here, and the external. Now we divide them this way. The internal senses are those senses which know what they know through the external senses. The external senses are what you know: sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. Now these are what we call sense consciousness, a sense, and there is an organ of it which makes us conscious of all our sensations and coordinates them for us. And then we have imagination, memory, and the estimative sense, which in animals we call instinct.
What would the estimative sense be in man?
Yes, in man we call it estimative.
Yeah,
And
what instincts would we be talking about in estimative in man? What would we refer to?
well, we have certain instincts, don't we? If I hurl a hot potato at you, your hands will go up one day without you thinking about it. You don't have to go and say, well, Alice is hurling a hot potato at me. If I don't put my hands up, I'll get burnt. Therefore, you don't do all that, do you? You just do it instinctively. Or if you put your hand on something hot, you take it away.
Well, that's a reaction. That's hardly an estimative. Where else is estimative sense, Alice, besides that? Give us some more.
In instinct in animals,
No.
estimative is only in man.
Does it cover aggression and sex?
Hmm?
Does it cover sex and aggression?
Oh, yes, there is a certain instinct to that, but you see, we don't use our instinct as much as animals do because we have an intellect. And so we use our intellect. But we have certain instincts. You know, you see a lion, you run away, don't you? It's instinctively. Things like that. Instinct works without reasoning, and it follows knowledge. You don't use your instinct except that you know something, you've seen it, or you know it in some way. Right? And that's the highest of all the senses, actually. It is the one that comes closest to intellect. And that's why, because always there is a principle in philosophy that says the highest of the lowest touches the lowest of the highest, So estimative is the highest. Now, all these are organic powers. Each one of these, they all have organs. So when we grow old and say we lose our memory, what's happened? The organ of memory is not functioning properly, and these have their seat in the brain. And now, to put it very simply, all our knowledge begins in sense, external sense. All our knowledge begins in sense, so that if anybody were born without any senses at all, they never understand anything. And they never know anything, because they won't know it through senses and they won't know it through intellect. Because our intellect has not got contact with reality except through the senses. They are our windows, the windows of the intellect, of the soul. And we we have bodies for that reason, that you see our intellects, where the intellects that be are only the divine, the angelic, and the human. They are the only beings with intellects. Now, the human intellect is the lowest of them all, fortunately, but that's how it is. It is the lowest of them all, and it is the only intellect that really has to reason. You see, God doesn't reason, and I'm not saying he's unreasonable. I am saying that he doesn't have to reason, because reasoning is the mark of an imperfect intellect. And when we have now our learned people saying that you have to keep reasoning all the time, you see, that is a mistake. Reasoning is for the sake of understanding, and not understanding for the sake of reasoning. We reason in order to understand, to come to a conclusion. Then we use that conclusion in another reasoning to come to a further conclusion in order to understand. Now, when we come to the divine intellect, God understands everything and knows everything. He doesn't need to reason. You see, the fact that we reason means that there's something we don't know and we have to arrive at it through reasoning. Well, God is above reasoning. You see? God is above, and the angels are above reasoning, because they haven't got a body and they don't get to their knowledge through senses. They have it infused. So they don't reason. We are the only ones who reason. We are the only rational beings, reasoning animals, and that's what we call man, a rational animal. Now, we are the only rational animals, and that puts us infinitely above the brute animals. Nevertheless, we're still the lowest intellect. Now, because all our knowledge comes through the external senses, then it passes from the external senses through the internal senses. The internal senses present it to the intellect, present all that information to the intellect, and the intellect, through abstraction, understands. The act of the intellect is not a sensation, it's an understanding. See? It's not a sensation. So the senses are needed for a man in order that he understands. And because he needs senses, well, he needs to keep them alive. Because he needs to keep them alive, he needs vegetative powers. And that's why we have bodies. Angels don't have bodies because they don't need them. Dr. Woodley used to say we have bodies for necessity, not for luxury. So we have bodies for necessity, and everything in man, including his senses, everything in man is for the sake of his intellect. The intellect is the big thing in man, the understanding, you see. Now, what is the difference between sensation and understanding? See, I had it before on the board. Knowledge is either sensation or understanding. This is done through an organ. This is done without an organ. It only depends on these organs for the information it needs to get in order to do its act, to form ideas. So it depends on them, but dependence does not bespeak identity. Dependence is not identity, is it?
Would you say it's eyesight? That's identity, it's the eyeballs.
No, it's the act of your power of sight. Seeing, the act of seeing. Is that what you mean? That's, yes, but that is done by your sight. Now you come to this understanding, and what is the difference? The difference is that sensation is always about something singular, as we call it. In other words, the mark of the singular is the thisy. When you see something, you see the board, you're seeing this board, this writing, this word at this time, in this place, and so on, of this size, of this color, all the thisnesses. That's sensation. It's always about this particular thing. But when we have understanding, you see, I see a man, I see Ron there, and I see Ron, the man of male sex, of this size, of this place, of this age, or that color hair, and so on. And that's what all my senses know. But I understand from that, I can understand what a man is, the nature of man. I understand man. And that man, as I understand him, doesn't befit just Ron. There's a man there, and a man there, and a man there, and a man there, and a man there. A female man and a male man. All male, all men, right? You see, so that fits a man who is a baby, Ron's not a baby, or a man who is a black, or a man who is red Indian for that matter. It doesn't matter. They're all men, you see. So the intellect is about universals. That's what you call a universal. And the senses are about singulars. Like, in other words, the intellect knows what something is, which we call an essence. The sense does not know any what's, it only knows this is. This, it doesn't know essences at all. So my dog couldn't even say I am a dog, because he doesn't know what a dog is. He only knows this smell, this sound, this taste, whatever he knows. So there is the difference. Now, these powers reside in the soul alone. These powers reside in the soul and in the organs and in the body, in other words, in the soul and in the body. Now, I want to say a word about the intellect and the will. Now, because I can understand with my intellect, I can understand anything at all. I can understand God, I can understand anything. There's no limit to what we can understand. You know, although we are just limited by our body to be what we are, with our intellect we can just go anywhere, do anything. So there is a certain infinity about them, and that's how that book we are using starts with, really explaining the depth of the intellect and the will. They are what we call objectively infinite. They are objectively infinite. The object being what they are about, what they understand. You see, the eye is not objectively infinite. Your power of sight is not objectively infinite. It can only know colored things. It can't know sound. Can it? Can your eyes know sound? No. Can your sense of touch know smell? No, because their object is limited. And that's why you have many senses, because they are limited. So you have a many where one doesn't suffice. That's the principle of economy. You need many senses because one's not enough. If you only have sight or you only have hearing, that's not enough. So you have many senses. We have only one mind, one intellect, because it's universal. It covers everything. You see, the intellect can understand smell, can understand sound, can understand sight, color, can understand anything. So you don't need many intellects, but you need many senses, because one doesn't suffice. So because the intellect understands anything and understands also abstract things, it can understand this concept, the concept of good, what good is. Now, if we say, well, what is good? I have to give a definition of good, isn't it? We all understand the word, but what is good? And we have been given a definition by St. Thomas. It's what anything appetites. It's what we want, what is wanted, what is desired. That is the good. All right? And because our intellect is before every act of the will, there is an act of intellect. You see, these two powers are intellective powers. This one is the one that knows. This one is the one that reacts to the knowledge. So it is not a knower, as I said. So when my intellect knows an infinite good, and infinite means without end, without limit. When my intellect understands an infinite good, my will is necessarily going to desire it. You follow? We necessarily desire to have that infinite good. That's the natural desire of God in man. Man naturally desires to see that infinite good, to know, to possess that infinite good. I'm not saying he naturally desires the beatific vision because he can't even know that it's possible, but he would desire, if he could, to see it. And we have Plato, who was a pagan philosopher who lived about 400 years before Christ, and he was the teacher of Aristotle. He writes a very beautiful passage where he said, wouldn't it be lovely if we could see infinite beauty and so on? He shows that even the pagans have that desire. It'd be nice if I could. Well, now, you see, before every act of the will, there must be an act of intellect. The will cannot act unless there is an understanding gone before it. See, that acts first and that acts second. The will is free. As we said last week, every will is free. The will of God, the will of the angels, and the will of men, where every will is free. Now, the question is now, are we free about everything? Yeah, we're morally bound, but are we free about everything? No, there are things we are not free about. And you see, I will explain that. It's true we are morally bound, but you see, when I understand, when my intellect, the intellect is the mind or the intelligence, call it what you like. When my intellect understands something to be not infinitely good, but limitedly good, like, going to the pictures. There are limitations to that goodness, isn't it? Because if I go to the pictures, I've got to miss out seeing my friend, or I've got to fork out some money to buy the ticket, or, whatever. I have to go out in the cold or in the heat or whatever. There are disadvantages. So it is not an infinite good. Then I am free about it. Every good that is not an infinite good, I am free about it. I am not saying it's got to be 50-50, 50% good and 50% bad. It's got to be a mixed good, what we call a mixed good, not an infinite good, but a mixed good. And almost everything we have is a mixed good, isn't it? Whether somebody should get married or enter religion, they're both mixed goods. You have to make up your mind and you are free about it. You are not free, though, when it is question of an infinite good. That's why no one is free, and no one can truly say and mean it, I don't want to be happy. Because you understand happiness as something completely good with nothing evil in it. You see? Now, the other things we are not free about, just as we are not free about an infinite good, we're not free about an infinite evil. Anybody here want to go to hell? No. No, we're not free about that. If my mind understands something to be infinitely evil, there is nothing to attract me in it. so I don't want it. I necessarily shun it. I necessarily don't want it. You see, I don't, so I am not free about that. I necessarily hate it, and I am not free about that. I necessarily love it. These other mixed goods, we are all free about. Not morally free, but we are psychologically free. So we are free about this. Now, when we understand God, what do we understand of God? What is God? Let's put it like that. What is God? That's the question St. Thomas asked when he was 5. What is God?
Creator of heaven and earth.
Creator of heaven and earth, yes. A divine being. What else? Infinite good. Yes, infinite good. So once my intellect has understand God as an infinite good, I necessarily desire to possess Him. You see, the will is happy when it possesses the thing it wants. The intellect, as long as it knows it, it's indifferent whether it knows or possesses or not, in a sense. But the will is the one that loves. The intellect doesn't love or hate. Love and hate and all the reactions to understanding are in the will. So the intellect just understands it. The will necessarily wants it. Now, when I understand God to be infinitely good, I necessarily want it. Well, how is it then that we commit sins?
Because they mix after good and bad.
Yes, but suppose, I know if I commit a sin, I am dropping God, aren't I? I'm preferring a creature to God. When I talk about sin in theology, it means mortal sin. How come I can do that if I'm not free about God? Now, you see, I'm free about God in this life, because in this life, God does not appear to us as infinitely good. He stops you from doing certain things you want to do, doesn't he? And that's why we can drop him. Say a man is in very bad need of money and he gets an opportunity to embezzle some money and he takes it. How could he do it? See, because God at that time did not seem to him as good as the money. He needed the money at that time, so he lets God go. God, it doesn't fulfill that desire for money at the time. So it doesn't seem to us in this life infinitely good. In the next life, when we see God face to face, the trouble is that in this life we don't see God face to face. We only know him abstractly. We'll say a word about how we know God in this life. Because we don't see him face to face, it doesn't seem infinitely good to us. But when we see him face to face, and we see him as he is, and we know him as he is, then we become impeccable. We can't sin. You see, in heaven, we are still free, but we are not free to sin. We can't sin in heaven. That's why you can't have somebody who's a saint today and the devil tomorrow. If they are saints, they're saints forever, aren't they? You can't sin once you see God. That's why, as we said last week, the angels were not created seeing God. Because if they were created seeing God, they couldn't have sinned. No one can see God and sin. Because once we see God as he is, and infinitely good, we cannot drop him. Now, how do we know God in this life? I lost it again. How do we know God in this life? Oh, look, put this bag away. You see, in this life, we know God by what we call analogically. In other words, we know what God is like, what God is not, and what God is more than. That we call analogical knowledge. Now, in other words, even in the scriptures, how does God describe himself? As a rock? Yeah. But in other words, I know he's like a rock. I know he's not a rock. I know he's more than a rock. And that is how we know God in this life. We don't know what God is. We don't see his essence. We know him in that way. And that's why we can drop him in this life. In the next life, where we know him and see him face to face, we cannot. Now we can say God is good. I can say God is good. All right, he's good like Margaret there. She's good woman, right? But his goodness is not the goodness of Margaret. It's a very different kind of goodness. It's an infinite goodness. She's not her goodness. She's received her goodness, hasn't she? From God. God is his goodness. His goodness is eternal. Hers isn't. His goodness is infinite. Hers isn't. And his goodness is a universal goodness. Hers isn't, and so on. You see? So I know what he's not, and I know he's more good than Margaret. That's all. I don't see how good he is. You see, we are, and God speaks to us in human terms because we understand things. You see, whereas what God understands best is the divine being himself, in other words, and through that he understands everything else he understands. What an angel understands best, he understands himself, angelic being, and what man understands best are material things. That's all. We're a fair way below the angels, although Scripture says we're just a bit below, but that bit is a big bit. Now,
a little less than the God.
A little less than the God, yes. Yes, they also calls us God, but anyway. Now, so you see, we are all the time knowing God that way, by comparing him, knowing what he's like, what he's not, what he's more than. When we say God is light, same thing, like that light, but he's not that light, he's not a material light, is he? And he's more than that light. So all the time, whatever we say, we know God analogically. But we know something of him anyway, and what we know of him is very useful for us, and what we know of him can help us get to heaven. So we're not agnostics. The agnostic, what's an agnostic?
He doesn't know.
Yeah, a man who says he doesn't know whether there is a God or not, and he doesn't know what God is. What's an atheist? And one who doesn't believe in God. So the atheist denies God. The agnostic denies that God can be known at all. We don't know God because he's not like us at all. Yes, he is. He is like us, but he's more unlike than like. So we can, as I said, drop God. So we have a free will, and we are free about everything that is lesser than God or that is not infinitely evil. No, we're not free about that. No one can really say, I'd like to go to hell for all eternity. We don't want that infinite evil, you see. So we are not free about that. Everything else, we are free. Now, because my mind can understand infinite good, and my will can want infinite good, nothing less than an infinite good is going to satisfy us forever. You see? Because it just isn't fulfilling the desire of my will when it follows the knowledge of the intellect of infinite good. And that's why St. Augustine said, Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our hearts are not at rest until they rest in thee. And they cannot be at rest. They are not at rest because no matter what we have, we want something else. Can anyone in this room say, I've got everything I want and I don't want anything else? No, you can't. You see, because there's something else we want. Well, until we get God. When we get God, our hearts are at rest, as St. Augustine said. And St. Augustine knew, because he was a bit of a lad when he was young. He chased pleasure and so on. But he comes back to God and he says, no, our hearts cannot be at rest until we rest in thee. So all these people today who talk about being fulfilled when you do this and when you do that, they are wrong unless they say when you get God. See, so trying to give us fulfillment without God is impossible. It's impossible. You cannot do it. Yes. Okay. All right. I don't know myself. Are we ready? All right, we'll carry on. Now, we were talking about the freedom of the will. You see, a definition for will is appetite. Appetite is always opposed to knowledge. There's knowledge, and then there's the appetite that follows it. Appetite for understood good. In other words, what is understood to be good? Now, why do we say understood? Because we can either sense a thing to be good, like when you taste lolly, very nice, very good. That's sensation, you see. Since every knowledge is followed by some appetite, you can take that principle down, because that's very important today. You know, they tell us, for example, that we can see all the pornography on television that we like, and it's not going to affect us. Well, it is. Every knowledge, we are going to react to it in some way or other. Every knowledge is followed by some inclination or some appetite. You love it, or you hate it, or you desire it, or you have an aversion for it, or whatever. Or you fear it, or you're saddened by it, but you are going to have a reaction. And so much, you know, for what they teach the children at school, too, the same thing. It's not going to be just bare knowledge. They are going to react to what they are being taught. So that's why we say that to read bad books or watch the pornographical films or anything like that, you see, that's a temptation or an occasion for sin. And we must remember that occasions for sin are to be avoided. So anyway, when we come to appetite, you see, remember I divided knowledge, where it comes again, into intellective and sensitive. Now, the senses do not understand anything. They sense, that's all. The knowledge of the senses is called sensation. The knowledge of the intellect is called intellection or understanding. Now, the will follows understanding. There are certain things that I don't sense at all. I only understand. For example, happiness. Or, for example, justice. Do you sense justice? Do you see it or smell it or feel it? You don't. Those abstract things, you only understand them. Now, if you love justice, that will be with your will, not with your sensitive appetite. You see, so we have, since every knowledge is followed by some appetite, we have intellective appetite, and that is called the will, and the senses are followed by what we call sensitive appetite. when the cat sees the mouse, and again, can't spell, I-T-E. When the cat sees the mouse and he chases it and he wants to eat it, what kind of appetite is that? Will or sensitive appetite? Sensitive appetite. But when you love justice, that's with your will. Normally they work together. When you love something with your will, for example, the grace of God, you want the grace of God, well, you have a feeling for it because we are made of body and soul and they work together, but they're not the same thing. Distinction does not mean separation. You see? When we say things are distinct, we are not saying they are separate. Chris's soul and body are distinct. They're not separate, are they? Not yet. They will be one day. They will be separated one day, but they're not separate now. Not separated now. You see, that's why you can't say, for example, in God, talk about the separate persons of the Trinity. They're not separate. They're the one God. They're distinct. They're not separate. So don't confuse the two words. All right. So you see, the will then goes only for what the intellect understands to be good, and it goes, and the sensitive appetite goes for what we sense to be good, but normally they work together. So we talk about two loves. We have two kinds of love, and this, I think, we should make this distinction very clear, especially when we are talking to young people, because today we talk a lot about love, but we do not distinguish the different loves. And a lot of young people have the idea that as long as you love something and you are sincere, you can do what you like. But sincerity is not a virtue. So, I can be sincere about wanting to rob you. Can't I? So it's not a virtue. But because you can't do anything wrong with a virtue. When you use a virtue, you can't use it to do wrong. If you can be sincere in doing wrong, then it's not a virtue. See? You can't misuse a virtue. All right. So, with our senses and intellect working together, we also have a sensitive love and an intellectual love. We have two kinds of love because all the passions, all the reactions, in other words, of the sense appetites and of the will come under the same names. You have love, the acts of the will are these: love and hate, desire and aversion, sadness, joy and sadness. We have some more. Hope and despair, and courage and fear, and anger. And the acts of the sensitive appetites are called by the same names, exactly the same. You see, when a dog sees a bone and he wants it, he loves it. That's a love, but that's a sensitive love. It's not the same love that you have for your friend, for example. I hope, anyway. So, you see, we have there again 11 of them. Love and hate, desire and aversion, joy and sadness, hope and despair, courage and fear and anger. We have all these 11 the same name, and they normally work together. Normally, if I love something with my sensitive appetite, I love my meal, I am hungry and I love my steak and onions, well, I also will to have it. You see, they work together, but they're not the same thing. That's what I'm trying to say. They work together, but they are not the same thing. Now, sensitive, you see, love and hate, that's Now, normally, because they work together, they can start either way. I can start loving my meal, and then my will loves it too, you see? Or it can be the other way around. I can love justice, and then I feel I want to do something about it. It can work that way, up, or it can work down. Now, normally, these acts of the appetites, they're what we call the passions. When they start there and they go up, they're called the passions. But they work together. And when they start here and they come down, we call them the emotions. There you are. So they're not exactly the same thing. Now, when it comes to love, I'll divide them for you. We call sensitive love concupiscible love or sensitive love. That's when you love something because it appeals to your senses. A man loves a girl because she's pretty. Nothing else in her that he likes, but she's just pretty. That's sensitive love, you see. Or love in the will, we call it love of goodwill. Goodwill. Or love of friendship. Now, they are not the same thing. This we have in common with animals, a puppy love. That's why we call it puppy love. Puppy loves a lot of things, doesn't he? Loves a bit of fun and so on. But that's only this kind of love. And this kind of love is a selfish kind of love. Because the senses are selfish. This can be is an unselfish love. So you see, this one is necessarily selfish. And this one is unselfish. And when it comes to getting married or something like that, we should have both of them. It's not enough to go after a pretty girl because she's easy on the eyes, but nothing else good in her, is it? You need to have the love of friendship. And if you have just love of friendship, but you can't stand being near her, that's no good either. So you have to have the two, and you have to learn to distinguish the two. And I'll say very quickly what we need for. You see, also this kind of love has got to have its object, in other words, what it loves, present to it all the time, or it will die, because it's a selfish love. So you see, if a man loves a girl just because she's pretty, when she goes away, he looks for another one. It doesn't matter.
That's what you mean, time heals everything.
You mean a bit more than that. All right. But when you see love of friendship, you can love somebody for 40 years and not see them. And when you see them, you can take it up from where you left off. It doesn't affect it. This is unselfish. And for this, there are certain conditions for friendship. So we look now at friendship. And this is what we're trying to do, be friends with God. Now, a friendship is, first of all, a love of goodwill. So for friendship, we need love of goodwill. In other words, this one. So if you have a friend, but you only love him because you can use him, that's not friendship, is it? That's selfish love. That's this kind of love. That's how you love an apple. You eat it, you destroy it. That's that kind of love, you see. Love of friendship is love of goodwill, and it's got certain other conditions that it's got to have. It's got to be mutual. In other words, both ends. You see, if I love Audrey here and she doesn't love me, there's no friendship. I love her very much, but if she doesn't love me, there's no friendship. So it's got to be mutual, and it's got to be mutually known. Because if I love her and she doesn't know that I love her, and she loves me and I don't know that she loves me, there's no friendship. We've got to know it. And then it's got to be based on the share of the same goods. Namely, the first good is the same nature. I can't very well be friends with a mouse. He doesn't share my nature. And then the goods that you possess, your house, mostly the best friendship is the one that's based on our intellectual and spiritual goods, because they're the deepest things in us. So that is short. They are the conditions for friendship. If we don't have that, we don't have friendship. Now, this is what we need with God. Love of goodwill, charity, isn't it? Love of God, that means willing good to the friend. Saint Augustine said, my friend is another self. I must love my friend as I love myself, not as I love my car or my apple or my dinner. I must love him as I love myself, that kind of love. And it's got to be, as I said, known, mutually known, and based in the same share of the same goods. In other words, you enjoy your friend's goods, even material goods, but the best goods you can enjoy are the spiritual goods. So, all right, that's what we need with God. Mutual, because God loves us, and if we love him back, it's mutual, isn't it? He knows it, and we know it, because he told us he loves us, and we know we love him. So it's mutually known, and it's based on the share of the same good, namely our nature first. Therefore, first of all, the divine nature in us, which we call grace, sanctifying grace. That's why if we don't have the same nature as God, we can't be his friends. It's like me being friends with a mouse. I can't. And that's why if we don't have grace in our soul, we cannot be God's friends. We are his creatures. He still loves us, but we're not his friends. You see, because we need this for friendship. All right, now, when God created Adam and Eve, he let them know all this. He let them know that he loved them, and he let them know that he created them for heaven, and so on. Adam had certain gifts. What were the gifts Adam had that God gave him? There were certain things God had to give Adam. For example, what did he have to give Adam? Well, all the things that he needed to have in order to be a man, didn't he? He needed a body and an intellectual and spiritual soul, an intellect and a will, and powers of senses and sensitive powers, and so on. He needed all that, didn't he? Oh, yeah, right. So if God created a man without a human soul, he wouldn't be a man. Or if God created a man without an intellect, he wouldn't be a man, would he? So he had to give him all this, free will and everything else. He didn't have to give him grace, but he gave him grace. And as I explained last week, by doing that, he elevated him above human nature. He made him Superman. We're really Supermen, you know. We are. He made him a Superman. He gave him grace and gave him a divine nature, which he put in him and created in him, but nevertheless, it's a divine nature. In virtue of that, we can be his friends. But now, if we have a look at Adam and Eve, and it's important that we do before we go on, because Christ came principally to get rid of original sin and also our personal sins. So we have to have a look at original sin before I go on to heaven and hell and so on. So, all right, there we have Adam and Eve. Now, Adam had certain other gifts that God gave him. Can anyone tell me what they are?
Immortality? Immortality?
Yes, Adam wasn't going to die. God had said to Adam, well, if you're a good boy, and Eve too, you're a good boy and girl, you'll go to heaven without dying. Without that, how do we know that? Well, see, the Bible says, if you eat of the fruit, you shall die, which means they were not going to die, doesn't it? So, he was going to go from, when we say he was in terrestrial paradise, terrestrial means earthly, so he was here on earth, but he was going to be taken to heaven, body and soul, if He behaved. So was Eve. That was one gift that God gave them. All right, what else? Yes, knowledge. They had knowledge. You see, they had knowledge and they knew also, had infused knowledge, not knowledge. Well, poor Adam was the first, and Eve too. They were the first two beings who didn't have parents. They couldn't, they couldn't learn from their parents, could they? But they were not only taught that when God gives somebody a special job, like for example the people who found an order or something like that, the founders, God gives them the grace to carry out that job. Say that about St. Joseph. I like to think that of St. Joseph, a favorite of mine. God makes him the father of his son, doesn't he? The adopted father, if you like. But he gives them the heart of a real father, because he had to be the father of Christ, and therefore he had the job, he had the grace to carry it out. He could order him around. We can't. He had to obey him. He doesn't have to obey us, does he? So God gives you the grace. Now, God creates Adam as the head of the human race, and he gives him the grace, all he needs to be the head of the human race. And one of these things was knowledge. So in his mind, God gave him knowledge. In other words, also the knowledge of what would happen if he sinned. Adam knew that if he ate that apple, he was going to knock the grace out of every soul that ever will exist. And he did it. And he was not only going to do that, but also kill us. We are all, have to die now because of original sin. So it was a very big sin. It was willing the spiritual and physical death of every human being. So it was a big sin.
That's hard to see when
Why?
you read the simple passage of Genesis. Eve went and took the fruit. The devil said it was good,
Yeah.
and that she'd like it,
Yeah.
and she had it, and then she offered it to Adam, and he had it.
Yes.
Now, there doesn't seem to have been any of that great awareness as to what's going to happen to our grandkids in that.
Of course he was, because Adam had the knowledge that when God gave him grace, he gave it to him to pass on to his children with generation. And his children were going to be born with sanctifying grace. Ours are not, are they? That's because of Adam. Because that's why we lost grace. He was going to pass it on to his children through the act of generation, and he knew that. And if he lost it, he just didn't have it to pass it on.
How much do you think they struggled with that sin?
Struggle?
Eve.
Oh, well, she had to face the temptation and make a choice. Yes, well, you see, the devil tempted Eve, and Eve tempted Adam. That is true. And it is true, too, that if you commit a sin under temptation, it is less sinful than if you do it in cold blood, So he had some excuse, and that's Adam was smart enough that when God said to him, "What have you been up to? What have you been doing? Have you been naughty boy?" He said, "The woman tempted me." Well, that was a genuine excuse. And she did the same. She said, "The devil tempted me." You see, she had a genuine excuse too. But it doesn't take away the knowledge that he knew that if he did it. So, people say, "Oh, God wouldn't punish the world just because he ate an apple." It's not just because he ate an apple. It's because he knew what would happen if he ate the apple. You see? We must remember that. It's not just, I can play with a gun and pull the trigger and all that, but if I know the gun is loaded, it's a different thing, and you're there, isn't it? Well, that's what happened to Adam and Eve. So it was a very big sin, which caused the death of God. Christ came on earth and died to save us from it. So it was a whopper. We can't commit a sin as big. You see, I haven't got the power to knock out grace out of every soul. I haven't got the power to cause the death of every human being. He did. And he took it and did it. So I know a few people want to get to heaven and have it out with him, but I think when they get to heaven they won't anyway. He's in heaven. It's the teaching of the church. Our first parents are in heaven. So there's hope for us yet, really, because we can't commit a sin as we. So there's the grace of God. Anyway, he had knowledge in his intellect, in his mind. He had natural knowledge and supernatural knowledge. These revelations that God made to him. In his will, what did he have in his will?
Great.
Love. Love, what kind of love?
Sheree.
Right? What did you say?
Oh, Eve.
Yeah, all right. He had love for her. It pleased him when he saw her. Yeah, and he said, "Oh well, at last this is something good. Born of my bone."
I've waited so long.
Yeah, he said that. All right. He had love for Eve. What other love did he have? Love for God above all things. Charity. Charity, love of God above all things. And that love of Eve as himself. All right, so he had that. Now, in his sensitive appetites, we have two sensitive appetites, you see, because the senses we always have more than we have in the spiritual powers, because we need more. Some are in that one, some are in that one. They're different. In his sensitive appetites, he had fortitude, strength to resist things and to do things and so on. And also, in his sensitive appetites, he had what we call immunity from concupiscence. What they call that? Temperance, if you like. Anyway, temperance. That means that he had strength and he had... What do you mean? Yes. So he had temperance. In other words, his passions couldn't arise in him unless he willed them to. Whereas our passions can arise any time at all, can they? And then we accept them or we reject them or we try to get rid of them. You know, we can see a picture and certain passions arise in us. That couldn't happen in Adam. It didn't happen in Christ. When Christ got angry in the temple, he got angry because he willed to be angry. And he got angry right to the extent he wanted to be angry, and at the time he wanted to be angry, for as long as he wanted to be angry. He had complete control over his passions. So had Adam, you see. Adam had complete control over his passions. So we have these gifts that he had. He also had other gifts, like, for example, he couldn't suffer. Adam didn't suffer. But when he found out, you know, they were silly to want to know good and evil. Some things are better not known. It's better not to know evil, isn't it? They found out what it was after the sin. All right, so when he committed the sin, he lost these, and therefore instead, in his intellect, instead of having, I put intellect, that should be here, intellect here. In his intellect, he had knowledge. Knowledge should be here, sorry. All right. Instead of knowledge, now he's got ignorance. Not ignorance of everything, but his mind becomes clouded. Our minds are clouded by passions. We don't see very clearly when we're in a rage, do we? That's why sometimes we don't say anything, because if we do, we might say the wrong thing. We can't think very clearly. And he's got ignorance now. Instead of charity, he's got love of self above love of God. He loves himself more than God. So we call that malice. Malice. instead of fortitude, he's got a weakness. We call it debility. And instead of temperance, he's got concupiscence. That means an inordinate love of pleasure. He couldn't control. And these are called the wounds of original sin. They are the wounds of original sin. 4 wounds of original sin. They are ignorance, malice, debility, and concupiscence. Here you have 4 wounds of original sin. Now, when Christ came to save us from original sin and give us grace back, he didn't give it to us back the way he gave it to Adam. Not exactly. I mean, we can't pass it on to our children as he would have. It is a personal gift now for each one of us. And 2 saints get married, their children are born with original sin. They can't pass on the grace. Secondly, you see, we are born loving ourselves more than God. And in that sense, original sin is a mortal sin because it keeps us away from heaven. We're not guilty of it, but we suffer the consequences. We are weak and we love pleasure inordinately. We chase pleasure all the time. These are the 4 wounds. And when Christ gave us grace back, he didn't heal those wounds. We don't get grace the way Adam had it. We don't get immunity from death and immunity from suffering and all these gifts. We only get grace, and we have to work to get these gifts. We have to work hard. It's the job of a lifetime, see, to get these gifts back. And we'll get them back through grace, because the wounds begin to heal the moment we're baptized. The moment we're in grace, we are healing.
We're healing or healed?
Healing. Oh, we're healed in a sense, but we have to progress. You know, grace is only the seed of glory. That's not glory. And you will be completely healed when you get to heaven. You see? So we have to understand this. Now, the other thing I find people object to about original sin is they'll tell you, well, it's not fair that, you know, we didn't commit the sin and we suffered the consequences. I'm sure you heard that objection. Why did God do it to us? The point is here that God did not owe grace to Adam. He didn't owe it to him. He didn't have to give it to him. So when he lost it, we couldn't go and claim it back. He didn't have to give it to us either, you see. So if I give Chris here $1 million, well, $100 million if I had them, and I say to Chris, you have to use this money, use the interest you can get on it and everything, but you are not to spend it. Pass it on to your children and your children's children, because I love you and all your children. And he goes and squanders it all. Goes to the, what do you call these places where you go and, what do you call these houses where you... Oh, TAB, yeah. Okay. He goes there.
Houses of ill repute.
And he loses all that money. Well, can his children got the right to come to me and say, you owe us that money? It's the same thing with Adam. Adam lost grace. He lost it for us too. He had no right to it in justice, because justice is the virtue whereby we give to everyone what is due to him. It's not the virtue whereby we give unto equality. We can't give unto equality. So if it's not due to us, we can't claim it from God, and we can't say God is unjust, because he doesn't owe it to us. That's the whole point. And I think a lot of people just do not understand this, and that is why they dismiss the doctrine of original sin. They just forget that there is a doctrine of original sin. But if we take, or sometimes I have met people who even deny that there is such a thing as original sin. But to deny that, you have to deny the redemption and the incarnation. You know, why did God become man if there was no reason for it at all?
Well, that's when God, in his divine intellect, when he created Adam, did he not know that Adam would be tempted and he would sin?
Yes.
So, putting it back on God, like he gave Adam all these things such as knowledge and charity and fortitude and grace, but he still knew Adam would turn around and sin. Had he given him enough of what he needed? Because he didn't have.
Yes,
he didn't
because
have
you see, God, when he creates something, he acts towards it according to its nature. Now, it's the nature of man to have free will, and he would have taken away his freedom, wouldn't he? So, you see, he creates him with free will. But God being God, he can get good out of evil. And you see, he gets good out of this evil of original sin. Because you have St. Thomas, for example. St. Thomas teaches that through original sin and the fact that we are born without grace and Christ died for us and we have the Eucharist and we have our Blessed Mother and we have all these things Adam didn't have and wouldn't have happened if original sin had not happened. The incarnation, the redemption and the Eucharist and the motherhood of Mary and so many other things, that now, he says, we can reach a higher degree of sanctity than we would have if original sin had never happened. So you see, God gets more good out of it. And like, God is the only one who can get good out of evil. And that's why, and St. Augustine, other big mind, giant mind really, says God would not allow anything of evil to happen in his works, were it not that he is so omnipotent and good that also from evil he can bring forth good. So that's why God allows it. That's why God doesn't stop us from committing sin, because he gets good out of it. I don't know what it is, but he gets something out of it. And in the end, it's not because of our bad will, but it's because he can get good out of evil. And that's why he allows it to happen. So you see, look at Our Lady, for example. She gives more glory to God than all of us put together, all humans put together. More, all the angels put together too. That's something, a great good he got out of that, didn't he? So you see, we have to remember this sentence of the St. Augustine. God would not allow anything of evil to be in his works, were he not omnipotent and good right up to this point, that also from evil he brings forth good. They're the sentences that have formed our civilization. Our Christianity, we must remember those big sentences, like the other one I quoted before of St. Augustine too. Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, our hearts are not at rest until they rest in thee. They are the big sentences. So anyway, if we understand something about original sin, you've done very well. Now I want to warn you, every year we get people who think, oh, that's too difficult, I could never remember it, or I could never repeat it. Well, you won't for a while, there's too much packed into it. I mean, you know, I'm only going over what we did last year in 2 or 3 classes. Don't let that discourage you. We'll go over them, I'll repeat over and over again as we go through it. Don't let that discourage you. If you go home and just find that you have learned one thing, you're doing well. You see, so please keep coming. Now, the other announcement I have to make is that I won't be able to give the class on the 26th, Friday night the 26th. So you have a holiday on that night, of February, I mean, 26th of February. So you come, it's Friday week, not next Friday, but the following Friday. But we'll be here after that. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I hate not giving a class, but I can't help it. I just can't be here on Friday week. All right, thank you very much. We'll say our decade of the rosary for the intentions of all the people who belong to this class, or who have been. In the name of the Father and of the Son. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Glory be to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
O my Jesus,
Forgive us our sins, save us from the fires of hell. Bring all souls to heaven, especially those most in need of thy mercy.
Our Lady, seat of wisdom.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I see a few new faces here. I would like